So Don joined the National Transportation Safety Board in April of 2011 and to serve as the director of the Office of Highway Safety. For 4 years, he provided executive level management and direction over all of the NTSB's highway transportation accident investigations throughout the United States. In May of 2015, Mr. Karol transitioned to his current position as a National Resource Specialist, actually based out here on the West Coast, and providing support as a senior technical advisor and consultant to management staff and organizations all across the U.S. on matters pertaining to multidisciplinary accident investigations related to highway transportation and highway safety. He's also provided technical expertise in a number of highway safety studies and special investigations. Mr. Karol, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Good morning. I needed as much technical assistance as I can get, so I can't walk around with a mic in my hand, so I decided to speak from the podium. I'm very pleased to be here today to speak about the NTSB, our mission, and how we use crash investigations to hopefully improve safety through our safety recommendations. I see a lot of familiar faces from various safety meetings I've attended. Like Brandon said, I was out in Washington, D.C. for 4 or 5 years as a director of highway safety, but without question, with my family being out in California, I'm would choose California over D.C. any day. So I'm very happy to be out here, and any members of the association that ever wants to contact me, I'm located in Irvine. I'll provide my information at the end of the presentation if you ever have any questions regarding crashes. Prior to joining the NTSB, I did a career in the Coast Guard, and I also was with the California Highway Patrol for 22 years as the leader of the multidisciplinary accident investigation team, which if you ever do have a catastrophic crash out here in California, it's most likely a CHP MATE team will be responding. Earlier this year, I was out in a major crash up in north of Fresno, and since I was one of the first on scene, I was the one in front of the press. And one of the questions that always comes up whenever I've been out to major scenes is somebody from the press says, should the public be worried? You know, is bus transportation unsafe? And my answer always is absolutely not. Bus transportation, as you know, is one of the safest forms of transportation. So I always try to emphasize that during our presentations. The reason that we're here at the crash scene is to hopefully learn from this so that these rare and isolated events don't continue to occur. So we look at every crash as an opportunity to learn. And obviously, if you're going to choose which mode of transportation you were going to take, whether it's motorcycle, car, commuter train, subways, rail, by far bus transportation is the safest of those. So I'm starting with this as my commercial for bus transportation before I start getting into giving you examples of catastrophic crashes we investigate. So I wanted to start with a positive note. So the presentation, I'm going to give a quick overview of the NTSB and what you can expect from us if we're on scene of a crash that maybe one of your operators are involved in. I'm going to talk about some California bus crash investigations and hopefully impart some safety messages on how we can learn from these tragic events. And then finally, hopefully I have time for some questions and answers. The NTSB, we're an independent federal agency charged by Congress with investigating every civil aviation crash that happens in the United States. We're also charged with investigating significant other accidents in the other modes of transportation. Our headquarters in Washington, D.C., we have about 400 total employees. Some of the employees are based around the United States, full-time teleworking from their home and responding out to crash scenes from there. I'm one of the lucky ones, and I'm located in Irvine, California. Our mission, like we said before, is to investigate crashes to try to determine the probable cause and issue safety recommendations on how to prevent future crashes. So what type of crashes do we investigate? In the other modes of transportation, like aviation, we investigate every single crash. In highway, as you know, there's about 37,000 fatal crashes a year occurring. So how do we pick them? We have a little over 30 investigators in the Office of Highway Safety that are responsible for selecting which accidents which we can make the most difference. Usually our criteria is those crashes of national significance and ones where we can make a difference. Obviously, sometimes being in a position where I was responsible for choosing which crashes we'd investigate, sometimes there's not a choice. If there's a major bus crash with a lot of fatalities, the public is going to expect that we respond out to those type of crashes to restore public confidence in transportation and also determine what can be done to prevent future tragedies. This gives a few examples of some recent crashes. The upper left photo is a train crash versus an SUV at a grade crossing in Valhalla, New York. The upper right is a school bus crash in Gray Summit, Missouri. A lot of times we respond out to school bus crashes because, again, the public expects us when children are injured or killed in a crash for us to go out and respond. The lower left is a 10-fatality Motorcoach crash involving impact with a tractor trailer. And the lower right is the Minneapolis bridge collapse. We usually respond to all major bridge collapse situations, again, to try to figure out what can be done to prevent future tragedies. When we respond out to a scene, we use a multidisciplinary approach. We divide into groups of investigators in the various disciplines. Our human factors or human performance group, they're responsible for looking at all issues related to the driver, fatigue, medical issues, whether it was distraction involved. The survival factors group, they're responsible for looking at what type of restraint usage may have, could have mitigated some of the injuries. We look at the crashworthiness of the vehicle changes that could be made. The vehicle factors group is primarily going to be focused at looking at mechanical issues possibly related to all the various vehicles involved. The highway factors group looks at the environment, whether it be the weather, whether look at the roadway, the signage, whether there's a guardrail or barrier in place. And finally, the group that you'll probably deal most with is the motor carrier operations group. The motor carrier operations group is the group that will look at the records of the company and see what type of compliance there is, but more we'll be looking at what the safety culture is at the company, what type of safety management systems you have in place and so forth. And then a lot of times we'll also form whatever other groups we need to figure out the factual information, what happened. If the truck or bus or whatever other vehicle we has a vehicle recording device on it, we'll bring people out from Washington, D.C. from our lab with the equipment to download the vehicles and find out what happened from the technical equipment on board. We'll also have a scene mapping group that will be responsible for mapping the vehicles and the scene. A very important part of how the NTSB does our job is what's known as the party system. The party system relies upon technical expertise from others to help us form the factual information of the crash and ultimately help us develop the best safety recommendations so that we can prevent future crashes. Members of the parties could be law enforcement, the State Department of Transportation, and often it'll be operators such as yourselves to participate in our investigation. If we do have a bus company involved and they become a party to our investigation, we usually require that it's not somebody in your legal department that's interested in mitigating litigation issues. The primary focus of our investigation is determined safety. So there's a requirement that that person be kind of a firewall between what your litigation concerns are and the ultimate focus of working with us to determine safety. So you'll actually be embedded in our investigation in one or multiple groups that I mentioned before. You may be a member of a motor carrier group, but we also may ask you to be a part of the human performance group if there's issues with the driver and so forth. Our investigator in charge on scene works with you to determine the most appropriate groups for you to be a member of. I know nobody can read all this. I just threw a couple slides in real quick showing some of the information we'll be looking for from the motor carrier if we go out to a scene. It's not much different than a compliance review, but we're looking more at the overall safety culture. And so I'll provide these slides to Brandon to post later in case you want to look at some of the information we'll be looking for. Generally, we ask if you're a party member or even if you're not a party member to provide these forms voluntarily. The NTSB does have subpoena power and deposition power also that we use in some cases in getting to obtain records. We usually use our subpoena power for health records at the hospital for drivers and so forth, but we can also use it to get records for the company. But generally, we work together with the companies, with the ultimate goal of safety. When we're on scene, every night we'll have a progress meeting, and the progress meeting will basically get all the members of the groups, and there'll be a briefing from each group chairman saying, hey, this is what we learned during the day, and hopefully what we need to do the next day and what additional information we need to collect. If your company is involved in a crash and you're a party member, your party member will participate in these meetings. So we basically, the whole purpose is to share information as a group to get the best factual information as to what happened. And we generally hold these meetings until the end of our on-scene investigation. Sometimes it's 7 to 10 days. And we'll hold a closeout meeting at the end to basically discuss the next steps. Also on scene, we'll be given press briefings. Generally, our press briefings on scene are given by our presidentially nominated or appointed board members. Sometimes it's given by our investigator in charge. We ask all the party representatives to allow our board member or our investigator in charge to be the primary person given the press releases, so there's only one source information. We don't want information getting out incorrect, and we never speculate as to what the cause of the crash is while we're giving our press briefings. Our final product, after we leave on scene, we'll be working on some of our investigations for the next year, possibly a year and a half. During that time, we're doing research, we're doing follow-up testing, our lab is looking at equipment sometimes. Generally around 6 months into the progress, we'll have all our factual reports completed. When we have our factual reports completed, you as a party member, we will send all our factual reports to the party representatives. What we do that for is so that you can provide a critique and find out to make sure everything that we're saying is factually correct. That's a very important process. I know sometimes you may receive an email saying, here's all these documents. Don't just blow that off. It's an extremely important part. We want your thoughts as to if we say somebody's 23 years old and they're 24, we want to know that. We want our report to be as factually correct as possible. The analysis portion of it, we'll take your thoughts and opinions during the process, but the analysis portion of it as to what we determine the probable cause is determined by investigators and ultimately the board during a final board meeting. The final board meeting is usually held about, in the time frame, about a year to 18 months after a crash happens. It's held in Washington, D.C. at our board meeting, in our boardroom. It's open to the public. It's also always broadcast on the web. And I invite everyone to watch a board meeting. It's very interesting. You can always learn some safety tips from watching our board meeting. Our next highway board meeting, and I'll discuss it a little bit later, is going to be on October 31st. It's going to be where we discuss the findings and come up with recommendations for the Palm Springs bus crash that happened a little over a year ago.
And Dom, before you move on, can you talk briefly about the docket and the docket system and what's kind of in there?
I'm going to get to that on the next slide. And then there's the one after that is November 28th. Those are the next two highway board meetings. So if you want to learn more about the NTSB, you want to look at our products, you can go to our website, ntsb.gov. In there on the tab, you can find our final accident reports. But what I invite any of you to do, where there's a wealth of information, is go to the one that's not circled, which is accident dockets. You go into there, and there's a lot of search items when you look at the accident docket. What I usually do when I'm going in is I just use the city. Most of our crashes, when I classify a highway crash, is classified by the city. So if you want to know about the Palm Springs crash, you type in Palm Springs, and there'll probably be a lot of crashes that happen in Palm Springs because there's aviation crashes, rail crashes, and so forth. And that, look for the one that associates with a date. You can open it up, and every document, factual document that we use to produce our report is in there. Sometimes it's thousands and thousands of pages of information, and it's a valuable source. You may want to go look for a specific report, like how did they come out with the fact that the driver was fatigued? Go to the human performance factual report, and that may be 30, 40 pages long, with a lot of it addressing fatigue. All that information won't be in our final report. Our final reports are generally about 100 pages long, maybe a little bit less. We try to only put the key information in there. But again, there's tens of thousands of pages in the docket that you can get valuable information from. So before I go over some of the recent crashes we've investigated in California and across the country, just wanted to briefly discuss our investigative process. Our goal is not only to figure out, what happened and how it happened, it's ultimately to figure out why it happened. So with all the groups working together, we go through a root cause analysis process. I know yesterday I saw on the agenda you had Tim Brewster talking about the root cause analysis process. That's something, obviously it's great to do at your own company when you have an incident. It doesn't have to be a catastrophic crash to figure out what was the root cause of this safety deficiency and so forth. We go through the same process. Briefly, I'll just hold this up. This is an example of just one of a recent crash, and I usually do this as a national resource specialist, develop a root cause diagram, basically going from the undesired event all the way down to some of the root causes. If you go down to the root causes, that gives us the best opportunity to influence safety. and there could be a whole presentation, obviously, on root cause, which I'm not going to go over today, but hopefully you got a lot of good information from yesterday's presentation. So I've only been at the NTSB for about a little over 6 years. This just gives you an example of the Motorcoach crash investigation since I've arrived in the last 6 years. So that is a total of 19. The ones in red are investigations that are ongoing right now. The ones in yellow are completed investigations. You can find information on our website about any of those crash investigations. Since we're in California, I thought that, and I know we're limited on time, I can't go over all 19 investigations. I want to briefly go over some of the recent major California crash investigations. From these 5 crashes alone, there was 37 fatalities and 135 injuries just out of these 5 crashes. As I go through the facts of these cases, I would basically prompt you to try to think of what you would do at your company. What could have been done maybe to prevent this tragedy? Always look at the crash as an opportunity to learn and to prevent future crashes. This was the crash that happened back in 2013. It was a 1996 Van Hool Motorcoach. It was operated by Scapatus Magicus. It was on a trip coming back from Big Bear Mountain, and it was traveling down Highway 38, coming down a pretty steep downhill grade. When at the bottom of the grade, the brakes ended up failing. The bus ended up coming down the hill. It impacted a passenger car and then crossed into the opposing lane and collided head-on with a pickup truck towing a trailer. The bus then overturned. In this crash, there were 8 fatalities and 36 injuries. After the crash, we found that all 6 brakes were in out-of-service condition. We also went back and looked further at the history of the bus and found out in the year prior to this crash, it had 19 roadside inspections. It was coming back and forth across the border a number of times, so it had 19 roadside inspections and it had over a 40% out-of-service rate. So there obviously were some red flags here. What concerned us a little bit further on this crash was within the 2 months prior to this crash, there was a number of compliance reviews done both at the federal and state level, and both of those found the company as being satisfactory. So one of the reasons that the NTSB is considered an independent federal agency is so that we can look at crashes like this and sometimes be required to make recommendations to either state DOT or even the Department of Transportation on a federal level, which we did in this case, to go back and look at the compliance review processes and try to find some ways of basically improving the process so that when we're doing compliance reviews, we're not doing a quantity, but we're more looking at quality compliance reviews so that we can get obvious red flag carriers off the road. So it's kind of a root cause analysis process. We could have just stopped and said, hey, the brakes are out of adjustment, it's that problem, but there were a lot of other systemic problems along the way. This company was declared an imminent hazard after the crash, even though it had got a satisfactory rating 2 months prior. So I always like the term imminent hazard being used after a crash. I mean, to me, I think it's a confirmed hazard at that point. So, you know, I think it's important that we try to get companies that are really operating on the margins, basically in compliance early on before they crash, because obviously they give operators such as yourself that are operating, trying to be safe, a bad name. You don't want companies out there basically making the public feel that it's unsafe to drive on a bus because of this type of situation. The next crash I'll briefly discuss is the one that happened in Orland, California. And I know that we do have some representatives from Silverado Stages, which was the motorcoach that was involved in this crash, and tragically lost one of their drivers as a result of just driving down Interstate 5 northbound and a tractor with a set of doubles having a situation where the driver had a lapse of consciousness, possibly because of a medical incident, crossed over the median and collided head-on with the motorcoach. The driver in this case did everything that they should have done. They braked and they swerved to the right, but you know, when you have a tractor with a set of doubles coming right at you, there's not much you can do. Even though we determined that most of the issues related to the car, the crash, dealt with the tractor and doubles coming across the median, we always look at what issues could mitigate injuries in the crash and so forth. So in this case, we looked at some vehicle issues that could have mitigated some injuries. It was a fast-spreading fire post-crash in this case, and we looked at the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards 302, and the standards that currently exist are much less than what exists in the aviation world and rail world. So we've asked the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to look at possibly upgrading the fire standards on motor coaches. We also looked in this case at the need for more pre-trip safety briefings. In this crash, there were a bunch of high school students from the Los Angeles area going up to visit a college up in Humboldt College, and because of the fire, they had difficulties finding where the emergency exits were, how to open windows, how to exit the vehicle, and so forth. The right front loading door was blocked in this case, so the only way to exit the vehicle was through the windows, which was 7-8 feet off of the ground. So a lot of injuries were occurring with people dropping out the windows also. We also addressed a number of other safety issues on the bus which could improve the evacuation of it. One big area that we looked at, and we found this in a number of recent crashes we've investigated with the front loading doors being blocked, as whether there should be a requirement for a second door on motor coaches. And we've asked NHTSA to look at the current standards permits a second door. It does not require one. So we've asked the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to look at that also. Next crash, and I understand there's some representatives from Greyhound here also. This was a Greyhound bus crash, happened up in San Jose, California. In this crash, the bus was traveling from Los Angeles up to San Jose. It was early morning hours, it was dark out, and there was light to moderate rain. The bus was traveling up north on US 101, and it was just about to reach the State Route 85 interchange. The bus driver was planning on taking one of the carpool lanes. As the bus traveled up, the driver mistook the travel lane, mistook the Gore Point area, which was poorly marked. Some of the lines were faded on it and so forth, and traveled through the Gore, which was 900 feet long. The Gore Point area, if you don't know, is that V area leading up to an inner thing. And it came up and it hit the crash attenuator barrels, rolled over, and ended up on its side. And this crash, there were 2 fatal and 13 injured. One of the key parts that helped in our investigation was the fact that Greyhound had a drive cam video on it that was both recording inside and exterior. So we got a good 10 seconds of view prior to the crash. And Some may say, well, he's making a long trip from Los Angeles. Maybe he was fatigued. Well, the video showed that he appeared to be alert and so forth. What the video also showed was the crash attenuator barrels, the reflectorized piece of material at the very end of the barrel was missing. Additionally, these, I forgot what type of safety device are, but they have reflectorized material. What happened is these crash attenuator barrels been hit back a month earlier, and Caltrans was supposed to have fixed the barriers, but they hadn't got around to doing it yet. And they actually just put these other reflectorized thing up. But guess what? It was windy out, so they were also down. So basically, when you looked at the videotape, you cannot see these barrels or that until you're right on top of it. And I'm not sure. I'm hoping that the NTSB would have came out with the same results if that dash cam wasn't available, but I can't say for sure. It was valuable information that gave a lot of information about the poor environmental conditions that were present. That is a 3D laser scanner. Usually when we go out to a scene, we will basically try to map the scene in 3 dimensions, so that gives just a still image of the 3D image of the damage to the Greyhound bus. And so this is an example. At the end of our crash, the board members come out with a probable cause statement as to what happened in the crash. So this probable cause statement was: the National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of the San Jose, California crash was the failure of the California Department of Transportation to properly delineate the crash attenuator and gore area, which should have provided improved traffic guidance. Contributing to the crash was the bus driver's error in entering the gore and the out-of-compliance signage, which affected traffic guidance. Contributing to the severity of the injuries was the lack of passenger seatbelt use. In this crash, in addition to the crash I spoke in Orland, California, there were only a couple people wearing the seatbelts. Both of those buses were fully equipped with seatbelts, but nobody was wearing them. So I know I really appreciate what's going on here in California with trying to figure out a way, now that all new buses are coming equipped with seatbelts, trying to find a way that we can get passengers to actually wear their belts. So that's a very important effort. Obviously, it's something that the NTSB keeps on recommending, but a recommendation is the easy part. The hard part is your job, is to try to implement it. So, you know, I appreciate the challenges involved in that process. So out of the San Jose crash, we made safety recommendations to the Federal Highways Administration to look at the requirement to actually stripe the gore point areas with cross-hatchings at certain locations. We also asked Caltrans to look at their processes. I think overall, Caltrans just forgot that they had to fix that out there because of their computerized work tracking process wasn't ideal. So this barrier should have had a reflectorized sign up there earlier than it did. We also made a recommendation to the bus associations, which is being accomplished at this meeting today and in other meetings around the United States. Our recommendation to the bus association was to encourage member passenger carrying companies, bus companies, to establish procedures to ensure that the seatbelts on all buses are regularly inspected and maintain their functionality and accessibility, and provide pre-trip safety briefings emphasizing the benefits of seatbelt use. So I know there's a session later today to talk about pre-trip safety briefings, and I know we've discussed about seatbelts quite a bit. The next crash, now this crash is technically still under investigation, but it's just about ready to be released. This happened on August 2nd, 2016. A 1998 Van Hool Motorcoach was traveling northbound on State Route 99 near Livingston. Livingston's up north of Fresno, for those of you who don't know. The The Motorcoach departed the lanes to the right, crossed over a 10-foot wide shoulder, and struck the end of a 76-foot long metal beam guardrail. As a result of the crash, 4 were killed and 19 were injured. You can see the guardrail, what it looked like before the crash and where it is at the end of the crash. Issues that we're looking at in this crash are driver fatigue. This company was operated, this bus was operated by Autobuses Coordinados, and there was basically poor or non-existent safety management at the company, even though I believe the company is still operating. So we looked at issues related to the oversight of this company. A big issue we're looking at in this crash is the highway safety barriers. We've had this issue before, over and over again, but this is another example of it. When I was up at the press conference speaking as the investigator in charge early on in this crash, the media said, "You've never seen a crash like this before involving a bus being split in half by a signpost." And then I had to say, well, actually I have. And I basically brought up the Bronx, New York crash, which happened back in 2011, and I explained that we had a fatigued driver there also that left the roadway, hit a guardrail. The guardrail obviously wasn't strong enough or robust enough to maintain the bus in the roadway, and obviously you see the results with 15 fatalities in this crash. We have been trying to convince the federal highways, even though there's so many priorities on the list, is the fact that most of our roadside barriers are not designed to basically maintain a motor coach on the roadway. So we're looking at having them look at other designs that could be used in the future. In the Livingston crash, did that signpost really need to be there? Let's try to remove some of these roadside objects that aren't absolutely necessary. And like I said, the Livingston crash was about to be released. We're not holding a board meeting on that. It was one that the board members reviewed the report, and we'll be having a press release as to the release of the crash that happened in Livingston. The next crash happened almost a year ago on Sunday, October 23rd, 2016, a 1996 MCI motor coach was traveling westbound on Interstate 10 near Palm Springs. The bus was operated by USA Holiday out of Alhambra. It was transporting 42 passengers. So in this case, what happened is Southern California Edison was stringing power lines across the roadway. So with Caltrans, basically looked at having the California Highway Patrol run a traffic brake. So they run a traffic brake in both directions to allow the power string, and they stop traffic. This is at 5 o'clock in the morning, a little after 5 o'clock in the morning. It's dark outside, and traffic comes to a stop. They do their work, and then they release traffic. At the back of the traffic queue in the westbound direction is this tractor trailer, which is a long-haul carrier transporting from the East Coast to the West Coast. The driver of the tractor trailer, after traffic was opened up, did not move forward. He had the truck stopped in park and was sitting there. And I'm sure the board will discuss at their board meeting reasons why that occurred, but I'm sure most of you can probably figure out what that probably is. And reason, again, I can't basically say what our board is actually going to say because it hasn't come yet, but October 31st, we'll be discussing the finding on this. And the motor coach was coming from a casino. The driver basically goes to the casino. Instead of getting rest, he's up gambling in the casino most of the night and drives back. His reaction going along, there's a long line of sight of actually seeing the truck, but it's obviously, there's issues with expectancy. You know, how expectant is there going to be a truck stopped in the lane? So basically, at the very last second, he tries to swerve to the left and runs into the rear of the bus. And that's what the bus ended up looking at. So we're looking at policies for traffic breaks. We're looking at fatigue issues, the oversight of commercial vehicle drivers, emergency egress. Again, this was a case where the front of the bus is demolished, so all the people that were exiting the bus had to exit through side windows and so forth. And we're also looking at whether collision avoidance systems would have helped prevent this crash. So those are the 5 in California. I got 5 minutes, so I'm going to briefly go over a couple of the other ones around the United States, and then I'll leave a minute or two at the end to answer any questions. And after we're done also, I'll be around outside during the break to answer any questions also. So this is actually a investigation that I'm heading up as a project manager on this, combining 2 or 3 crashes involving the transportation of migrant workers. These 2 crashes, one in St. Marks, Florida, and one in Little Rock, Arkansas, resulted in 10 fatalities and 48 injuries. These carriers don't get much attention because of all the exemptions that exist for the transportation of migrant workers, and so they're referred to as farm labor contractors. The one on the bottom right happened at a intersection where the bus driver driving a repurposed school bus went through an intersection and was broadsided by a tractor-trailer combination. 4 migrants were killed in this crash, and there was also a lot of injuries in the crash. The front door was also blocked in this case. If it was not for the rear emergency door in this crash, basically it would have probably had 30, 40 fatalities in this crash. They all exited the rear door on this. Another issue we're looking at this crash, similar to the Orland, California crash I mentioned before, we didn't dig in deeply dealing with the saddle tanks on tractor-trailer combinations. In this case, this vehicle, the Freightliner Columbia, has a 7-foot-long, 150-gallon tank right alongside the vehicle, easily exposed to traffic. So we're most likely going to be making some recommendations dealing with improving the integrity of fuel tanks on heavy trucks. And we went back and gave the Orland as an example, and we had plenty of other examples to give also. So hopefully that will be an impetus of some action in that area. School bus crashes in Baltimore, Maryland, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. Both of them could have been easily prevented. The one in Baltimore, the school bus company basically had a driver that had multiple seizures before, and he had a seizure in this case, drives down the road and basically has a seizure and crosses over the road and runs into a transit bus. The other one was a young 24-year-old kid in Chattanooga with a history of a bad driving history. Well, they hire him anyway, drives down the road, 35-mile-per-hour zone, probably going excess of 60, and collides with a big tree, and a lot of small kids were killed in that one. Biloxi, Mississippi, it was coming up a crossing. It was a grade cross often. There was signs for low ground clearance. The driver wasn't supposed to be going this direction by the trip planning. So we're going to be discussing pre-trip planning and so forth on this crash. And in addition to big buses, we also look at mid-sized buses quite a bit. So we're looking at a crash in Conkin, Texas, involving a mid-sized bus which had 12 fatalities in it. A vehicle driven by somebody loaded up on all types of drugs basically crossed over the road and collided head-on with that vehicle, killing the people. We're also looking at, on these new mid-sized buses, are lap belts enough? The injuries in this were horrific because of the huge speed changes they went through, but I think our findings are probably going to lead to the fact that a shoulder belt situation would have obviously mitigated the injuries more. So we're probably looking at there. And again, our whole purpose from investigating crashes is to learn from them. At the NTSB Academy, there's a plaque on our wall that says dedicated to the victims of transportation accidents and their families. From tragedy, we draw knowledge to improve the safety of us all. So that's what we do at the NTSB, and I'm sure that every one of you will be looking at small incidents at your company to try to learn from them also. Thank you. I don't know if I have time for any questions.
I think we can take a few questions. We do have a mic, and we'll be happy to come around to you. We'll start here with Louis Hotard.
Hi, Don. My name is Louis Hotard, and I work with most all of the guys in the field on and off. My question is the barriers, the highway barriers, as you stated, it's the most consistent, repeatable issue. Going back to the 1999 Mother's Day crash in New Orleans, the bus went off the road, and this is not a dig at NTSB because they do a phenomenal job, but how, since 1999 and earlier, the bus industry and the manufacturers have to respond to everything related to the bus, and the government, the feds, have not done anything on the barriers yet. So how could an NTSB accelerate the barrier problem? Because Orland was barriers, the truck came across. I mean, we have buses hitting bridge columns, running off. That's the common denominator in almost every runoff, and it seems like they're not responding, and our industry is having to keep changing buses and meeting all this stuff, and the highway is not doing anything.
I agree. But this past summer, I was up in San Francisco, and I was a speaker at the first International Roadside Safety Conference. And it was basically full of people from around the world dealing with these issues. And my presentation dealt with heavy vehicles and the compatibility of our barrier systems. And there were a lot of state DOT people there and so forth. And to be honest with you, most of the state DOT people came up to me and says, we like your recommendations, but they're not realistic from the aspect of we have all these other competing demands. We have type 2 barriers out there that can't maintain a passenger vehicle. So their basically stance has always been is, yes, it'd be nice to do, but we're not able to keep passenger vehicles from going off the road. So that's the answer we keep on having, but we keep fighting for it, but I'm not very optimistic. Maybe if the bus industry wants to push more, that will get some legs also. I'll give you the phone number for Federal Highways. Yes.
All right. Hi, this is Jeff Gilchrist from Prevo. Thank you for the presentation. That was really good. I really liked it. I have questions, more than one. I'll ask them in order of increasing difficulty. Okay?
I want the difficult one first.
No. First one is the root cause analysis chart. Can you make that available to us?
I can give you all the materials.
Okay,
You're talking about this specific one?
No. Just like the general layout so we can take that back with us.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
This is actually from using the tool that I use is from the NASA root cause analysis course and so forth. So I have kind of modified it for highway crashes.
Awesome.
So I've been doing that for the last few years. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, second question. How do we become party to an investigation?
Generally at a scene, the investigator in charge determines who is a party. Now, if a Prevost bus is involved, a lot of times we do have the manufacturers as a party, especially since we want to understand all the systems on a bus. I don't know if we've had many Prevosts, and I can't remember any recent ones.
It's more of a generic question. I mean, it doesn't, just because Prevo has a great record and Van Hool has a less great record. Okay, so, okay, last question. So obviously, I don't know if you were here yesterday, but you heard Lewis's question as well. There's a general feeling from the operator side and as well as the manufacturer side that we're getting regulated into a corner. Or into a box. So with my last most difficult question is, or maybe not, with technology changing, how does the NTSB determine whether they're going to make recommendations that are sort of reactive or preventive? So like determining whether a safety technology you know, you're talking about barriers, but like, what if we had technologies that didn't have vehicles going off the road? We're sort of, you know, how do you determine, how does that play into whether you're going to be reactive with your thing, with your recommendations, or proactive?
Well, as you know, we've made a lot of recommendations dealing with safety technology on vehicles. And obviously safety technology on vehicles, we are strongly in favor of, because that obviously helps take the driver out of the equation. You're never going to basically fix all the human error parts of it, so we've done that. Generally, when we make our safety recommendations dealing with vehicle safety technology, we like to see proven effectiveness of it. In other words, we can't see, oh, this person just came out with this new technology, let's recommend it. We generally point to a number of studies that show that it's proven effectiveness. The implementation of it is very difficult because there's not a lot of regulations coming for requiring it, and you know, there are some types of technology that even though the industry doesn't like to be over-regulated, you know, if we believe it'll save lives, we're still going to make that recommendation.
Hi, Elaine Fickett with Untitled Chapter. I wanted to make a comment that while the recommendations from the NTSB are certainly well-founded and well thought out, occasional political reaction becomes difficult for the bus operator, with everybody else trying to hop on a bandwagon and regulate us too. The Orland crash, you know, the legislature in California tried to pass a bill for the windows this and the roof that and a second door. And while we can agree that all those things could help prevent a tragedy, the problem for us as the operator becomes, and this is thanks to a discussion I had with Stephen Evans, that we're so caught up in trying to be compliant with regulation that we lose sight of day-to-day safety. Simply because of lack of time, you're always dotting the I for compliance without being able to really stress safety differently than that.
I can definitely understand. Obviously, haven't sat in your seats, and I understand that you are all running companies, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and we hope that our recommendations ultimately have a positive effect in the end, and that you can do both. You can run the daily operations and deal with the regulations. I mean, my frustration looking back at 50 years of crashes and buses is that 50 years ago we were making recommendations that we're still making today. So the fact that California has been proactive in basically saying the federal government's not making regulations, let's make it ourselves, maybe the rest of the country will follow, I'm personally in favor of, but I know that many of you are dealing with the aftermath. But hopefully California, like it does in a lot of things, sets the standard for the rest of the country as far as safety goes, whether it be law enforcement and all that. I'm a Californian, so I'm proud of what happens in California, but I do sympathize.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jim Galusha with Silverado Stages. And I appreciate all that you guys do. And I am very happy that you're going to finally look at those saddlebag fuel tanks. I was always amazed that one of the recommendations was that the coaches be equipped with more flame retardant material. And I couldn't understand how it would make any difference when 100 gallons of diesel fuel was spewed inside the bus. I mean, the seat frames were melting. But anyway, I am happy that you are finally looking at that and making a recommendation. It has been 3.5 years since that accident. I'd have a question, though. Have you been able to make any determination as to the increased risk factor related to the time of day? I noticed you had a couple of catastrophic crashes that occurred during the early morning hours, and that's just catastrophic crashes. But just crashes in general, has your department made any determination as to associated risk factors?
Yes, I'm not, because I've dealt a lot, obviously, with driver fatigue, but I don't want to basically say something out of place. We have some of the leading fatigue experts in the country, and we have a lot of past studies. This has been something that's been overly researched over the years, and we've had studies that basically points to various times of days. We've actually made recommendations about operators when they operate during periods during the night. You know, there is a, compared to the number of miles traveled and the number of catastrophic crashes, there's an overrepresentation during that time frame. But the specifics and so forth, I can obviously, I have your card, I can give you some actual studies that actually point to it. And one other thing, mentioned the fuel tanks, just to follow up briefly on that, is in the Orland crash, the only reason we didn't make recommendations out of that specific crash was because of the high impact forces, and we could not find whether any alternatives, even by putting the fuel tanks and the frame rails on that catastrophic crash, we can't be sure it would have made a difference. However, on the one we're making the recommendations, and some other ones, we're going to be able to make a recommendation based on the accident. So we use our accidents to determine what recommendations we make.
Is there a final question?
Hi, John Buskell with Silverado Stages. Has there been generally a trend over the last 50 years that you've been doing this of increased number of accidents? Decrease, the same?
Regarding, and I'm sure you're talking about Motorcoach
Right.
crashes specifically. I'll have to get back to you for sure, but you can look as far as when you're talking about crashes. Today, I've been primarily talking about crashes involving the occupants on buses being injured and killed. I haven't been talking about the number of crashes where motor coaches are actually hitting other vehicles and that. Those type of crashes over the last several years have been actually going up. But the number of people actually killed on buses have been steady for a lot of years, in the range of 50 to 60 occupants a year being killed in bus crashes.
So it's fairly flat.
It's fairly flat, yes.
Okay.
Would like to thank our presenter and give him a round of applause.
Thank you.